honored to be here this afternoon. I am from the United States. I am representing the U.S. Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues today. And I'm going to talk about an issue that has been important to the Commission, but is not the subject of a particular report. It is, the issue is compensation for research-related injury. I thought it might be helpful to just spend a couple of slides telling you about our commission, since every commission is slightly different. So in the United States, the Presidential Commission was appointed by President Barack Obama at the end of 2009. We first met in 2010. We serve as an advisory body to the President. In the next slide, I'll show you, we're not the first commission in the United States. There have been several in a row. For the last 20 years, the commissions in the United States have served at the behest of the President, and so have lasted for the duration of the presidential administration, and then when there's a new president, there is a new commission. So we have been in being since President Obama has been president. Like many commissions around the world, ours is multidisciplinary. It's small. We have 11 active members at the moment, with a variety of disciplines, mostly physicians, lawyers, scientists, philosophers, bioethicists. And most of what we do, we've done 7 projects thus far. Most of these projects, all of them actually except for one, have been done at the request of either the President of the United States or the Secretary of Health and Human Services. So we haven't chosen our topics. We've been asked to do certain topics. Today, and we're working currently on one related to President Obama's recently announced BRAIN initiative. But today what I wanted to do was talk about a little bit about particular recommendations that the U.S. Presidential Commission has made regarding the issue of compensation for research-related injury, because this is a very important topic for the world, and one that's gotten a lot of attention in recent years. I'm going to spend a little time talking about the Presidential Commission's ethical justifications, a little bit about the current U.S. regulatory framework and practice, and a little bit about previous commission's recommendations, and then where to go from here. So that's the plan. Reference to this issue of compensation for research-related injury comes up in 2 commission reports. And I say 2 even though there are 3 things on this slide, and that will become clearer in a moment. The 2 documents on the left of the slide are a report on sort of human subjects protections that I'm going to talk about a little bit more, and we had some to say about compensation for research injury in that project. And then on the right was a very particular project looking at under what conditions it might be ethically acceptable to enroll children in research when we're studying interventions that might prevent disaster in bioterrorist attacks. So medical countermeasure research, a very specific issue. The Human Subjects Research Project began with an expose that occurred a couple of years ago by a historian at a university in Washington, in the United States, Susan Reverby, who uncovered files that showed that there were a series of experiments in the 1940s done in Guatemala, conducted by US researchers in collaboration with Guatemalan collaborators, and funded by the United States. And there were a number of really serious ethical problems with the way this research was done. So this uncovering of this experiment led the President to ask the Commission to do 2 things. One, to do an historical investigation of what actually did happen in Guatemala in the 1940s. And we did that, and there's a very detailed history of those experiments that you can get online if you're interested in that. And then he asked us to, given that, take a survey of the contemporary situation to ask the question of whether or not the protections that we have in place today are sufficient to protect human subjects in US funded research, whether it's done in the United States or abroad, and in particular, whether something that's similar to what happened in Guatemala could happen again. So as part of that project, one of the things we did was convene an international research panel. And I'm going to show you a picture of that panel because some of you are in the room or some of you work with people who are on this panel. This was a panel that was convened for the purpose of discussing the sort of landscape of protections today, and also to make some recommendations to the Commission. We met 3 times, had very good, productive discussions, and summarized those discussions in the document that you see in the corner, which is not very clear, but it's called Research Without Borders, Across Borders, sorry. And the document made 5 recommendations to the Commission. The first one was researchers must demonstrate respect for human subjects in their communities, and gave a couple of ways that that could be implemented through community engagement, through ongoing international dialogue and collaboration, and through clarification of equivalent protections, a very particular issue related to our regulatory structure. That ethics training should be available for investigators, IRB members, and others, that we should have greater efforts to enhance transparency, monitor ongoing research, and hold researchers and institutions accountable, that the U.S. should implement a system to compensate research subjects for research-related injuries, and that there should be continued efforts to harmonize and guide the interpretation of existing rules rather than adding new rules for human subjects research. So I want to focus on the 4th one, the recommendation of this panel that the U.S. should implement a system to compensate research subjects for research-related injuries. The panel discussed the fact that many countries provide protection for human subjects by requiring sponsors or investigators or others to provide or to ensure treatment for research-related injuries. And in fact, it's often been said that the U.S. lags behind in this area, that we do not have a system that requires compensation for research-related injury. Now, it is true that some U.S. institutions carry liability insurance. There are other mechanisms whereby people get treated for their research-related injuries, but it's not a requirement for receipt of federal research funds in the United States. And so the panel felt that the U.S. should consider creating a system for compensating individuals in the event of research injury, and actually suggested that maybe we should look carefully at a model that exists in the United States called the Vaccine Injury Compensation Trust Fund, which is a public model which allows people who have received vaccines to be compensated for adverse effects of those vaccines. Those are not research vaccines, though. Those are already approved vaccines, and most of those vaccines are given to children. So it is true that the current U.S. landscape, there is no U.S. federal regulatory requirement to provide treatment or compensation for research-related injury. However, there is a requirement in the regulations that researchers tell people whether or not there is compensation and what that compensation might look like. So there's a sort of funny mixed message there in terms of what's going on. It's also true that although we don't have a federal requirement, there's a landscape that's a bit of a patchwork. So this study was actually done subsequent to the Commission's report. And what these investigators did, David Resnick and his colleagues, they surveyed publicly available policies from the top 200 research institutions in the United States, top meaning those who receive the most research dollars from the federal government, and then described what their policy said about compensation for research injury. And you can see very clearly from this slide, more than half had no policy at all, no compensation offered. But the other half had a mixture of what they described as discretionary, conditional, and unconditional compensation. The discretionary, basically by their definition, was policies that said we might provide compensation for research injury. The conditional was we'll provide compensation for research injury under certain conditions, like if the participant has no insurance or their insurance doesn't cover it, or the sponsor will offer it, or something like that. And unconditional, which you can see is less than 4% of the institutions looked at, unconditional, no conditions on compensation. There are other sort of parts of this patchwork, and I just want to allude to some of them. This is a chart that comes from the President's Commission report. The NIH Clinical Center, which is where I actually work, does provide short-term care for research participants who are injured, but is explicit about the fact that it won't provide long-term care or financial compensation. There are other agencies in the U.S. government. NASA is the National Aeronautic and Space Administration. They provide compensation for injuries based on a sort of workman comp kind of model. Medicare actually says it will cover the reasonable costs related to injuries, but only as a secondary payer. And what that means is if there isn't a first insurance company that will pay, then they will pay. The University of Washington is one example, and one that is often cited in the United States, one university that chose many years ago to self-insure, and they provide treatment in-house for research-related injuries and reimbursement for out-of-pocket costs. And then there are private companies that sell liability insurance to institutions or research facilities who want to buy it. However, it's been pointed out, and Lizzie Pike is an author who's done a fair amount of research on this topic, has pointed out that the primary remedy in the United States for compensation for research-related injury is tort law. And as she points out here, it's perhaps out of inertia, awareness of the complexity of implementing a compensation system, or a mistaken belief that injured researcher participants have adequate recourse in the courtroom, that the United States has chosen to rely on tort law. And she also points out that there are some groups for which tort law is very ineffective. We see also, in contrast to other countries around the world, and I'm not going to read this chart, but the report from the Commission very carefully tried to look at policies from many countries around the world and tried to document them so that we can see what the various options are. So the Commission, recognizing that research is done for the common good, yet risks are borne by subjects, and many of those risks are unforeseeable or unavoidable, really does believe that those who sponsor or engage in research have an ethical obligation to protect those who volunteer. And they describe this as encompassing two duties: primary protection from undue risk, and secondary protection, which might be a means of limiting or reversing harm through appropriate medical care of injuries. And these are justified by principles that many of you also have used in justifying this kind of program in other countries. Justice, including compensatory justice that compensates participants who voluntarily accept risk for the benefit of others, and reparative justice for those who are harmed from wrongful acts in research, as well as a recognition of a special duty of beneficence that researchers have towards participants based on their relationship with them to protect them from harm. And so the recommendation, which you can't probably read because it's small, basically says people who are research subjects should not have to bear the costs of injury. But the recommendation goes on to say, therefore, the Department of Health and Human Services should study what the best mechanism is for the United States. So I want to say a little bit more about that. There have been actually 4 decades of commissions and task forces in the United States that have recommended some kind of system for compensation for research-related injury, and we still do not have one. There have also been groups like the Institute of Medicine who has made that recommendation, and certainly there are international guidelines that suggest that everyone should have a system, including the most recent addition to the Declaration of Helsinki. But the problem is that all of these documents have significant variation in terms of the substance of their recommendations, in terms of whether a system should be implemented or there should be further study, but also the details of what the system might look like. What is the correct model in our context? Should it be a no-fault insurance system? Should it be federal grants compensations? Should it be a workers' compensation model? Or should it be based on the vaccine compensation program model? Who should fund it? Should it be the federal government, the sponsors, the research institutions? What forms of compensation should be offered? And which participants should be compensated? All questions that many people have struggled with. And so Meg Larkin, who's a current fellow in our department who's doing some work on this topic, has suggested that the different ethical bases that have been put forth for a compensation requirement are pulling in different directions and therefore do not always align with the means of compensation proposed, and that very few scholars have addressed what types of harms should count as research-related harms that warrant compensation. A paper that was written by Leslie Meltzer about a year ago also talks about this issue. She describes the various different justifications that have been provided for creating a system of compensation for research injury have actually put us into a situation of what she terms moral gridlock, that they're pointing in different directions as to the details. Who should be the responsible for paying? Who should be responsible for, who should receive the benefits? What kind of benefits? And that we need to clarify which ethical justifications we want to follow. And there have also been lots of discussions and lots of controversy over some of the details, the details of a compensation program. How do we determine how do we determine the injuries that are caused by research? Should all injuries in the research project be compensated for? Should all types of research injuries be compensated, including pecuniary or spiritual? What degree of injury has to pertain in order to get compensated? What kind of remedy should be offered? Should it be treatment? Should it be compensation in terms of financial repercussions? And these all should be guided by ethical justifications. So the other recommendation that the Commission made was that because this has been an ongoing debate for many decades, that the federal government should study a system and come to some decision, but also should make a public statement if they decide not to do anything, to come out publicly and say, what are the reasons that they decided not to create a system for research injury? I'm going to say just one thing about the other report, because I don't have really time, but this is a particular circumstance in which it's children in a very sort of potentially risky or a very precarious kind of research in which the benefit to society is somewhat more conditional. And so the Commission thought, regardless of when the study might be done, in other words, in advance of some kind of an attack or subsequent to some kind of an attack, that a system for compensating any injury to the children in those research trials was absolutely mandatory. So in conclusion, I want to just say that the Commission has come up with has agreed with and articulated clear ethical justification for treatment and compensation for research-related injury, but recognized also that there is a need for further analysis regarding the specific implications of the ethical bases for such an obligation, and that those ethical bases might dictate the models of compensation that might be appropriate in our context, which injuries are compensable, which events are compensable, and who are the responsible parties. And that there are also many decisions that need to be made in any system about various elements: cause, type, degree, remedy. And we're beginning to learn a lot about this from other colleagues in this room and other countries who have gone through some of these discussions themselves. Thank you.